Okay, I think the number of attendees has just about evened out, so I think we can begin. So welcome everyone to the EU Artificial Intelligence Act and what it could mean for public safety webinar. I am Amy Leet, I'm the Communications and Press Manager at EENA, and the person you'll be listening to today is Benoit Vivier, who is the Public Affairs Director at EENA. So it's a bit of a hello from Benoit. So as a bit of a background to the webinar, the European Parliament has adopted its position on the AI rulebook with an overwhelming majority on the 14th of June, paving the way for the interinstitutional negotiations set to finalise the world's first comprehensive law on artificial intelligence. And as part of that, certain AI systems may now be classified as high risk, and they may have to follow basic rules related to safety and transparency. And of course, for us in the public safety sector, AI systems for dispatch or determining dispatch priorities may be considered as high-risk AI systems. So under the rulebook, the legality of things such as facial recognition, crime prediction systems is under discussion. And nonetheless, both providers and users will have to be aware of upcoming regulation on such systems. So in this webinar, we'll break down what the EU AI Act could mean for you, and you will have the opportunity to pose any questions you may have on what the next steps are for the future of AI in the EU. So just a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded. Your attendance is not made public. However, the actual recording will be, and your questions obviously answered at the end will be. Please ask any questions you've got through the Q&A system you'll see on the bottom of the screen. And we will address them all at the end. And you may notice that the webinar is being captioned automatically. We hope this is useful for you. If you have any problems at all, you can send me a private message using the chat function of Zoom. So I will now hand over to Benoit, who will begin the webinar.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are. So I'm Benoit Vivier, I'm Public Affairs Director, and I will be doing the webinar today. And just trying to sum up this big piece of legislation is something like 200 pages of proposal, plus the Commission, plus the Council. So it's a lot to try to summarize in only an hour. I'll do my best. I also have the chance to be able to see who is connecting at this webinar. And I know some of you, and I see you come from very different backgrounds. So I'll try to adapt to everybody. Of course, I'll try to still make it a bit entertaining and nice, and so that everyone can follow. So I will not be able to go really in the details of everything, but hopefully I can give you all the information you need. And then if needed, we can also follow up privately. So I'm here to discuss about this legislation on the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. The European Commission communication on that says that it's the first political entity to adopt a legislation on AI. I don't know if that's the case, but if it's the case, yeah, here it is, and it's quite an ambitious piece of legislation. So we've all read many articles about it. I'm here to debunk a bit what is true, what is wrong in what we read, and try to tell you whether this will affect public safety or not. And also I'll give you a few hints on where we are in the procedure, because the procedure is not over, the act is not final. So I'll tell you where we are and what the next steps are on this legislation. We are not on Netflix, so I have decided to spoil this presentation. So the AI will not be banned in the European Union, unlike what I have seen in some articles. There will be some processes and some rules that will apply to AI in emergency communications handling. So I will tell you everything in the next minutes. Another spoiler, it's not that bad, the processes to be applied, so it should be fine. And there will still be a bit of drama between the EU institutions, and I will tell you why in my presentation. So just a few words about myself. I'm Public Affairs Director at EENA. I joined EENA in 2015, so I've been here now for 8 years. And I follow legislation for EENA, legislation related to emergency communications. And my background actually is related to politics of the European Union. And yeah, so hence my presence here in this webinar. Just want to tell you also who I am not, and I think it is quite important for this webinar. I am not a judge and I do not interpret the legislation. So what I will tell you is just my understanding of the legislation. It cannot be used in a court, my own understanding of the legislation. So I'll just tell you what I know, what I understand from the legislation. I will not tell you my interpretation, and it is by no means anyway an official interpretation. I do not predict the future also, unfortunately. So I will tell you what may happen. As I said, the legislation discussions are not over. The act is not final. So I will tell you what is at stake, what may happen, but I will not use the future terms actually. So we'll use may or would more than will during this webinar. All right, let's go. And so I'll first tell you a bit about the EU decision making. I know it is boring, but I'll try to make it as fast and as clear as possible because it is very important to understand where we are now and what will happen next. I'll then give you a few introductory remarks about the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, and then we'll go deeper in the legislation and analyze a few important provisions. Then we'll finally discuss the next steps, and then there will be a time for questions and answers. All right, so we'll start with the EU decision-making. That's the boring part, and I'm sorry for those who have had already this presentation from me, but I think it's important for everyone to be on the same level of understanding for this legislation. So in general, there are three different kinds of legal acts in the European Union: the directives, regulations, and the delegated acts. A directive, it's the most common piece of legislation that is adopted at the EU level. A directive is binding on the member states of the European Union. The member states have to apply it, which is why it's quite different than international law in general. It's EU law is binding in general. And the directive, it requires what we call the transposition in the member state law. So a directive will say a list of objectives saying like the member states should do that within that deadline, but then the member states are free to decide how they want to do it, and they have to adapt the legislation into the national laws. So the national parliaments will vote laws to basically to take this European legislation and put it in the laws of the member states. On the contrary, the regulations that are also binding are what we call self-executive, which means that a regulation, it directly applies. It doesn't need to go through any transposition in the member states' national order. So it is directly in application, and member states cannot do anything to adapt that except where it's mentioned. In general, the EU legislations, the directive and the regulation, they take a lot of years to approve. It's in average, it's 2 years up to 3-4 years. So of course, sometimes you need to just amend the legislation, some basically non-essential elements of the legislation. We'll see that a bit later with the AI Act. So for that, we have the delegated acts that can be adopted by the European Commission. There, the procedure is much faster. It takes around 2-3 months to do it. And it aims at completing a previous legislation by adding more technical elements and basically changing the non-essential elements of an act. So this is also something that exists, and we had an example a few months ago with the delegated act supplementing the European Electronic Communications Code. So I just wanted to make these points on these 3 legal acts. There are more, but I will not discuss that today. Also, just want to make a point because this is a question I often receive. Where does the EU law apply? So the EU law applies, of course, to the member states of the European Union. This is what you can see in the dark blue. And I should add to this map that it also applies to the French overseas department, as well as the part of the Saint Martin Island in the Caribbean, the French part. And it also applies here, it's not on the map, to the Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores, who are outermost regions of the European Union. And for laws related to the internal market, it also applies to the so-called European Economic Area that is composed of the member states of the European Union, plus Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, which you can see in light blue on this map. So this is where this European legislation will apply. It's in these countries that you can see on the map. All right, let's the fun begin. We'll speak about the role of the different institutions in only a few minutes. It will be very brief. Once again, we have 3 main institutions in the EU decision-making process. The European Commission. This is mostly, let's say, composed of technocrats, if I may say. the role of the European Commission is to propose draft legislation, and sorry for the typo here, and once the legislation is adopted, to make sure that the legislation is correctly enforced. So they will monitor what is happening in the member states to check a bit whether the legislation is well implemented, and if that's not the case, they will defer it to the European Court of Justice. Then we have two other institutions, the European Parliament. The Parliament, it represents the citizens of the European Union. For EU citizens here in this call, we have elections every 5 years. It's to elect our representatives in the European Parliament. And we have also the Council of the European Union, which represent the national government. So here it's basically our ministers who just go, they meet in Brussels, and they also approve the legislation. And so these two legislation, the Parliament and the Council, they can amend the proposals made by the Commission, so they can suggest changes to some text, and then they adopt the legislations. So this is how these three institutions work together. You have the Commission that proposes, and then the Parliament and the Council that votes the text. All right, that is it for the EU decision making. It was fast, and I see the number of participants has not decreased, which is a good sign. So now we will speak about what you came for. It's the EU AI Act. So just a few elements first. I just mentioned the different types of norms that we have in the European Union. This, the AI Act, we call it an act because it probably sounds nicer, but it is a regulation. So as I said, it's self-executive. It doesn't need any transposition into the law of the member states. So it will be directly in application with a specific deadline. I'll come back to that a bit later. The objectives of this act is to basically ensure that AI systems respect our fundamental rights that we have in the European Union and the values of the European Union. I think it's quite important because we all see that the AI is really getting bigger and bigger, and we want to keep it under control and make sure that our fundamental rights are guaranteed. So this is the main purpose of the legislation. Now the purpose is to provide legal certainty. So to have, it's in general, the purpose of the single market is to have same legislation that applies in all the member states of the European Union, which also facilitates the investment, because it's of course it brings certainty regarding the markets in different countries because they are covered by the same legislation. And actually, so the third objective is linked to that, is to facilitate the development of a single market for AI applications. So where we are with the procedure, I'll just come back to the institutions. So in 2021, the European Commission published a proposal. Remember, it was 2 years ago. So of course, the AI 2 years ago was not exactly what it is now, which is why there may be a few things missing in the initial proposal by the European Commission. So they published a proposal 2 years ago. And only a few weeks ago, the European Parliament voted some amendments in first reading. You can see it took 2 years to just come up to an agreement only within the European Parliament. At the same time, the Council of the European Union adopted what they call a general approach. So a general approach is just some kind of informal position. It's a preliminary position of the institution, but then there is still yet to have their own first reading on the text. So it will again take some time because you need to have an agreement of the different member states. And I'll go more into that in the next steps at the end of this presentation. I'll just continue with this introduction by telling you, I think it's quite important each time you check a legislation to see how terms are defined. It's always the first thing you should check in a legislation. And so here is the definition of AI system. So it's a software that is developed with one or more techniques and approaches. Here you have the different list of approaches, and can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, generate outputs such as content, predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing the environments they interact with. So it's quite a broad definition. Actually, the Council of the European Union is trying to narrow down this definition by removing the statistical approaches in the point C of this legislation that is to be followed. So that was just to give you some context of how AI is defined in the EU regulation. One important element, that legislation will apply to providers of AI system in the EU but also users also of AI systems in the EU, but also providers of systems that are located outside of the European Union, but where they produce an AI system, where they put the AI system into the market in the EU, or where the output produced is in the Union. So it's quite important to have in mind, if you call here from outside of the European Union, that regulation may have some impact on your activities. So bear with me to understand how. And so here is how I can very broadly summarize this legislation. So here the philosophy of the decision makers was to identify different types of risk and different types of AI applications and come up with different framework for each of them. So we have some risks that are considered as unacceptable. So clearly these AI practices will be prohibited. We'll go through them just after this. We have some practices that are considered as high-risk AI systems. So for the high-risk AI system, they will not be banned. There will just be some specific requirements that will apply to them, and I will tell you which requirements there are. Then we have some AI applications that will just be subjected to some transparency obligation, and then we have some minimal or low-risk AI practices that come with no restriction, actually. So it's a different framework for each type of risk. That was the idea of the EU decision makers. All right, so we'll start with the AI practices to be banned. So that's the highest type of risk. And here the proposal of the European Commission is quite clear. The practices that you see will be banned according to the proposal of the European Commission. So it's basically the placing on the market of an AI system that causes physical or psychological harm of a person. We have the general purpose social scoring by public authorities. If you have watched Black Mirror, you may see what I refer to. So it's basically public authorities just doing some scorings to give unpreferential treatments to citizens with low scores. So this would be banned by the European Commission. And then it's the use of, hold on, each word is important, real-time remote biometric identification systems in the public spaces for the purpose of law enforcement. So here it's biometric identification system, remote, but also real-time. So it does not apply to prior or a posteriori biometric identification systems. So these three categories would be banned according to the proposal of the European Commission. Sorry, I'll just go back to the slide before. So for that last category, the use of real-time biometric identification systems in public spaces for law enforcement authorities, there are exemptions for the search of potential victims of crime, for the prevention of an imminent threat to the life or the physical safety of people or of a terrorist attack, and for the detection, localization, identification, or prosecution of a perpetrator. So for this, it would still be possible to use these AI systems. However, the European Parliament, in its vote, it was proposed, that was made a few weeks ago, the European Parliament voted to delete the exemptions that I just listed. So the real-time remote biometric identification system would be banned for all law enforcement authorities, according to the European Parliament vote, which once again doesn't mean that it will be the case in the final version of the act. The European Parliament also added a few prohibited practices of AI system, such as the categorization of people according to sensitive attributes, except for for research purposes. Systems to assess the risk of a person or a group of persons to commit criminal offenses based on, where they're from, where they live, etc., like what background they have. This would be banned. What is very important, and I think there will be drama around that, what is banned is the facial recognition systems from internet or CCTV footage. This has been proposed by the European Parliament. Honestly, I don't think the Council of the EU and other decision makers would agree with that. So there will be a lot of very intense discussions on that very elements. And finally, another prohibited practice, according to the European Parliament, should be the systems to infer emotions for law enforcement authorities. border management systems, also in workplace and education institutions. So basically anything that is used to detect the emotion of the person in these four categories. And the general approach of the Council actually suggested to extend the prohibition of AI system on social scoring, not only to the government, but also to the private actors. So this is the view of the Council, to be seen if it is in the final version of an act. Just take a bit of water before I continue with the most important part of the act, most important in size, especially and in terms of articles proposed. It's the high-risk AI systems, and that will be very interesting for all of us here. So I'll first explain what these high-risk AI systems are, and then we'll see the different types of rule that would apply to such systems. So first, what are these systems? According to the proposal by the European Commission, so these systems are, first of all, the biometric identification of people. So it's the AI system intended to be used for the real-time and post-remote biometric identification of natural persons. We have AI systems that are used for the safety components in the management of critical infrastructure. So here is the road traffic and the supply of water, gas, heating, and electricity. We have the AI system that are used in education and vocational training. We have the AI systems that are used for the employment, workers management, and access to self-employment. So it's basically the systems that are used for the recruitment and selection of natural persons, and also for decisions on the promotion and termination of work contracts. What is quite important for us, we'll see here, is the category of access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public service and benefits, because here there's a subcategory that says that the AI systems intended to be used to dispatch or to establish priority in the dispatching of emergency first response services, including by firefighters and medical aids. These are considered as high-risk AI systems. Quite important to mention here. I'll continue the list. We have the law enforcement system. The use of AI for law enforcement purposes. These ones that you can see here. So assessing the risk of people for committing criminal offenses, which would be banned according to the European Parliament, but in the proposal by the Commission, it is not banned. For detecting the emotional state of a person, for detecting what we call the deep fake. So it's basically the manipulation of images or videos to basically to put someone on the image when it shouldn't be the case. So to evaluate the reliability of an evidence, to predict the occurrence of a criminal offense based on profiling people, to profile people actually in the course of detection, investigation, or prosecution, and for crime analytics. So all these practices that I just mentioned, they would be categorized as high-risk AI systems. And finally, we have also practices related to migration, asylum, and border control management, some related to administration and justice and democratic processes. And finally, in the list also, we should add where AI is used as a safety component of certain products. So there's a whole list of legislation where it's applied. It's usually, like train systems, etc. But what is quite important is that we have also here in the list the equipment that are subjected to the Personal Protective Equipment Directive and also to the Medical Devices Directive. So if any of you uses AI system as a component of such products, then it is categorized as a high-risk AI system according to the European Commission proposal. In its vote, the European Parliament, the members of the European Parliament voted to add a few systems in this category, including the evaluation, the classification of emergency calls. So here I have put the exact amendments and the exact text that was voted by the Parliament. It's basically AI system intended to evaluate and classify emergency calls by natural persons, or to be used to dispatch or to establish priority in the dispatching of emergency first response services, including by police and law enforcement, firefighters and medical aid, as well as of emergency healthcare patients triage systems. So this would be covered in the legislation according to the European Parliament, and then other practices were added to the list, like the critical digital infrastructure influencing the outcome of an election or referendum, and the AI system used by large social media platform. So these are added to the list, and the European Parliament has voted to delete from the list the use of AI systems by law enforcement authorities to detect deep fakes. Just to add also here that the general approach of the Council of the EU is a bit more restrictive. Basically, they say that a high-risk AI system is a system, well, that should be out of this list. The systems that do not lead to significant risk to the health, safety, or fundamental rights, then it shouldn't be in this list. So it is much more restrictive, the proposal from the Council of the European Union. Sorry. So here is, I'll go back to what was proposed by the European Commission, because it's the most certain thing we have for the moment. Of course, that might be altered as we've just seen. Just want to make a point here. These systems will not be banned. So these are just listed as high-risk AI systems, and specific rules will apply to such systems. So we're going to see in brief what rules there are. So first of all, the high-risk AI systems and the providers of high-risk AI system, there should be a risk management system. It should be established, implemented, documented, and maintained, and it should comprise a few elements, such as the identification and analysis of the known and foreseeable risk, any potential risk that may emerge then, like a risk of misuse also, for instance. All of this should be listed and documented. And basically, at the end, I'll quote what is in the legislation. Measures should be such that any residual risk associated with each result is judged acceptable. So here it's important to really anticipate the rules that may arise from the use of such systems. There should be some data governance framework to basically make sure how the data are used and in what context, also how the training is organized, how the validation is done, etc. So there should be some measures to ensure that this is well thought of, basically. Technical documentation should be drawn up before the system is placed in the market, and the legislation lists a few elements that should be in that technical documentation. I will not go in deep, but it is in the legislation. There should be some capabilities in the AI system to enable the automatic recording of events. This is what we call the logs while the system is operating. So this is quite important. Then the operation are sufficiently transparent to enable users to interpret the system's output and use it appropriately. So these are some transparency obligations and information obligations. There should be some human oversight to basically oversee the use of the AI while it is in use. And finally, this AI system should be designed taking into account robustness and cybersecurity principle. This is quite obvious, but it is recalled in the legislation. Then there are some specific obligations for different categories of users. The most important one is the providers of high-risk AI systems. So they have to basically make sure that what I just described before are well done. So they should have the quality management system. They should draw up the technical documentation. They should undergo a conformity assessment procedure. Then they have to draw up an EU declaration of conformity. And finally, a fixed CE marking. So that's like as any product that is sold in the European single market, I would say. They have to keep the logs that automatically generated. I just described that. If needed, they must cooperate with the national authorities in charge of the enforcement of this legislation. And this is important also for the providers of AI systems who are based outside of the European Union. They have to appoint a legal representative who is based in the European Union and who would be responsible for the enforcement of this regulation to the products that are put in the market. Then there are also obligations that come for the importers of such systems, so like they have to ensure that the conformity assessment procedure has been done, that technical documentation has been drawn up, etc. So basically, once again, to apply what I just described before. Same obligations are also on the distributors, so they should require the CE marking, etc. And we have also obligation on the users of AI system. So basically to monitor the operation of the AI system and to also to keep the logs that are automatically generated. And finally, just want to mention that the European Parliament has also added a fifth category of stakeholders, the providers of foundation models. So foundation model is to ensure it's basically defined as an AI system model that is trained on broad data at scale, is designed for generality of output and can be adapted to a wide range of distinctive tasks. So the definition is quite wide, and I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that. We'll see one of the applications a bit later, but that's a fifth category where providers of such models, they have to basically ensure compliance with the regulation, as it is the case for the other types of stakeholders that are listed in this slide. I'll continue for the high-risk artificial intelligence system. So the European Commission, according to their proposal, they will set up a database that would list all of the high-risk AI systems. The registration would be mandatory by all the providers of high-risk AI systems. So they will have to register the system. There's a few information that are already listed in the legislation that will be required in the registration process. And then eventually this database will be accessible to the public. So this is done for some kind of transparency. And some additional provision, I will not go too much in the details because it can be a bit specific, but basically the member states must appoint national notifying authorities that will be responsible for setting up and carrying out procedures for the conformity assessment bodies, also the appointment of such bodies. The European Commission should adopt common specifications where standards are lacking. So there will be a list of standards to comply with. If there's no standards, the European Commission will be able to adopt some common specifications. So there will be some conformity assessments. I have gone through that when I spoke about the obligations on the providers of AI system. And I also mentioned the EU Declaration of Conformity and the CE marking. Once again, these are basic requirements for the European Union single market. Also, the providers of AI systems should report any serious incidents or malfunctioning that they notice. There will be specific national notifying bodies that they have to report the incidents to. And as I said, the registration in the EU database will be mandatory for the high-risk AI systems. This was a bit long. I hope you are still with me. I think it was important to go through this because some of you may have identified how some AI system in our sector could be covered by the legislation, and it's the biggest part of the legislation. So there's some requirements. To be fair, I find them quite basic in general, and I think it's important that anyway there is some philosophy and reflection behind the use of AI system, and that we reflect on the protocols that we're using, what data is used, how the AI system is used, and this is what is required here. And I don't think all of this is asking too much, basically. I'll just go through the other provisions in the legislation, just to mention that for other types of AI system, there are some transparency obligations. So here what the legislation says, I'm going to read it because it's quite important to use the right word. So providers should ensure that AI systems intended to interact with natural persons are designed and developed in such a way that natural persons are informed that they are interacting with an AI system, unless this is obvious by the circumstances and the context of use. And this obligation does not apply to the law enforcement authorities for detecting, preventing, investigating, and prosecuting criminal offenses. There are also transparency obligations for the emotion recognition systems and for the use of deepfakes. So if you manipulate an image to put myself in the image, for instance, without my consentment, then you should say that this has been generated by the AI. If it has been generated by the AI, I think it's quite important also to have these transparency obligations that apply to basically any AI system interacting with a natural person. Also, if I speak with an AI system on the phone, I should be aware of it. It's Sounds quite basic, but so it is in this legislation. The European Commission has also adopted, well, there is a chapter in the legislation that is called Measures to Support Innovation, though I'm not really sure how this encourages innovation, but anyway, there are some AI regulatory sandboxes that will be implemented. So a regulatory sandbox is basically, it's a controlled environment that facilitates the development, testing, and validation of innovative AI systems for a limited time before the placement on the market. So if you're not sure of the legislations and so on, and that it is done well, you can use one of these sandboxes, which would simulate a real environment, just to make sure that it complies with the regulations, and then you can put it on the market if you want. So that is done under the chapter of supporting innovation. Continue here, there are some measures for the governance of artificial intelligence in the European Union. The European Commission has proposed the establishment of an European AI board, which would be a body kind of under the control of the European Commission to lead the cooperation between the member states, to guide the European Commission and other bodies, and to basically assist any relevant authorities. The European Parliament has made some amendment to transform that into an AI office, so which would be an independent body from the EU institutions. So that is more or less the difference. I don't think it's needed to go in the details now, but just so you know, there will be a body responsible at the end of this legislation for AI in the EU, and to basically to make sure that this law is well implemented. The decision makers also proposed the drawing up of codes of conduct. So this has not been drawn up, but it's to be drawn up after the legislation. It's a voluntary code of conduct. Anyone can sign it or adhere to it. It applies mostly to the non-high-risk AI system. So basically any other such AI system, they don't have to follow a very strict rule, but they can just follow what is written in this code of conduct. And it would relate to, for instance, the environmental sustainability, the accessibility for persons with disability, the participation of different stakeholders in the design and development, etc. So this would be in these codes of conduct. And as I said, it is voluntary, so this would not be mandatory. Just to mention that there are some elements related to the penalties. As I said, a regulation is mandatory, it is binding. If you don't respect it, you can be subjected to sanctions, and such fines can go up to 30 million euros or 6% of the total worldwide annual turnover for companies. So it can be quite high sanctions, and so hence the importance to comply with the legislation. The European Parliament, in its vote a few weeks ago, has also proposed additional rules. So first of all, they have proposed to lodge a complaint, the possibility for any EU citizen to lodge a complaint with a national authority. What does that mean is that if someone feels that there have been, that they consider that the AI system relating to them infringes this legislation, what I just described, they can lodge a complaint to the national authority. They can also require an explanation of an individual decision-making done by an AI to the provider of the AI system. So if myself, for instance, I feel that I have been disadvantaged, or that a decision made by the AI system has had some legal implications on me, or some health implications, etc., I can make a request to the AI provider to justify how this decision has been taken by the artificial intelligence system. The European Commission is also asking, the European Parliament is also asking the European Commission to make some guidelines on the implementation of this legislation to basically help the member states and the different stakeholders better implement the legislation. And the European Parliament has also proposed rules for the providers of generative AI. So generative AI is more or less ChatGPT, what we can relate to ChatGPT or any other similar application. So it is defined as the foundation models used in AI system, specifically intended to generate with varying levels of autonomy content, such as complex text, images, audio, or video. So the European Parliament has indeed a few obligations on this, and basically it says that they should comply with the transparency obligation that I described a bit earlier. So it should inform the user that the content is generated by AI, which maybe to me quite of a limitation here or lack of ambition, if I may say, because here, let's take an example. If I use ChatGPT will just have to tell me this text is done by AI, which is quite basic, but like then myself, I have no obligation to, if I write my thesis with ChatGPT, I have no obligation to say that this has been done with such system. So this is a bit to me the limitation of the transparency obligations. Then the generative AI, of course, should not breach with the EU fundamental values. It is, of course, quite important. And they should also not breach with the EU legislation and any appropriate legislation on copyrights. Okay, that's it for the legislation. It was quite a challenge to summarize in around half an hour, pages and pages of proposals where every word matters. I hope you had a good insight of what is in the legislation. Now I will tell you what is coming next. So as we saw, this is what we saw earlier. The proposal was published in April 2021, and last month the European Parliament voted the text in its first reading. Now what we wait is a formal position by the Council where they propose really the amendments. This should be coming probably by the end of the year or early next year. So now the ball is in the camp of the member states of the European Union. As I said earlier, the Council represents the national governments. Once this is done, once the Council have taken their position, it is extremely unlikely, it never happens that they take exactly what is proposed by the Parliament. They will propose their own amendments, as we've just seen. Then the three institutions will enter a series of meetings called trialogues. So it's basically some negotiations between all these institutions to come up with an agreement, something that will be satisfactory for all the institutions. It's typically meetings that take like hours, and that are composed with representatives from each of the three institutions, where they just try to come to an agreement. It's all done informal. It's not a formal procedure. They just try to speak behind closed doors to come up with an agreement. Once an agreement is reached, the European Parliament and the Council can proceed to a formal vote where they have to vote the text in exactly the same words, so that the act is then considered as final. Once the act is final, it will enter into force just after the publication in the official journal. And then all the obligations that I just described will enter into application 2 years after the entry into force. So once the act is adopted, it takes about a month until the entry into force, and then it takes 2 years until the obligation come into application. Just to sum up, thank you for bearing with me. We're just good in time. It is 3:15, so it's good. Just sum up, so AI will not be banned. It will still be allowed. Just a few specific practices will be prohibited, and it's still to be seen which ones exactly. What is very important is the high-risk AI systems. They should come with specific protocols, documentations, strategies, which probably already exist. So I think the requirements that are asked here are not do not go too far in general. Then there are also transparency obligations on some types of artificial intelligence applications. It's quite important to have them in mind. And as we've just seen, the legislative procedure is not finished yet. So the exact act and the exact measures are still to be determined. That's it for my presentation. I see there are some questions already. Just feel free to type them in the Q&A box, sorry, and I'll be happy to respond. I hope I have the answer you need. Otherwise, I can also get back to you by email, and you can actually contact me by email if you need, or by LinkedIn. Here are my contact details.
Indeed, as Benoit said, please feel free to keep on sending questions to the Q&A. We're going to start with them now. So one question we've had asked twice is, are telecommunications included in the critical infrastructure list on the high risk list? So according to the European Commission proposal, no, they're not included. Just go back to the relevant slides. There were many slides. It takes some time. It's probably this one. So yeah, what is included, I'll just go back also to my notes to make sure I read
correctly. What is included is basically this, so the road traffic and the supply of water, gas, heating, and electricity. However, the European Parliament has proposed that the critical digital infrastructure falls under the scope of the list of high-risk AI systems. So then telecoms may be part of it, but it's not even sure. So it's like the European Parliament adopted this requirement without really detailing what is the critical digital infrastructure. So I'm not exactly sure. We'll see in the final act that comes, but it may be the case. At the moment, it is not.
Okay, the next question we have is referring to the list of potentially banned AI systems. Are there any definitions of these systems? So for example, internet for recognition or the definition of social scoring systems by private actors? Have they provided any definitions in the way that they've defined AI?
Yes. Perhaps you can email me and I can tell you, because if I read it now, it would be very boring. But yes, there's some definition. Also here, I tried to really summarize the article. And of course, it doesn't, it's not the exact wording that is used by the Commission. It's quite hard to, let's say, digest such wording. You have to be prepared for like 5 lines long sentences. So it's better if you just email me and I'll send you the exact text that is proposed.
Okay, as a reminder, that's bv@eena.org. Please send all of your
Exactly.
questions, which require lots of explaining that way. So the next question we've got is there anything about enforcing social media platforms to stop deep fake dissemination?
Not in the AI Act, but I believe it can be covered by other legislation. So first of all, the very large social media platforms have been defined, depending on how many users use the platform, etc. The specific criteria to be part of it. It's especially in the Digital Single Act and the Digital Markets Act. So sorry, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, getting lost with all the legislation. So there are some obligations for such very large social media platform. Here, what may come, is what has been voted by the European Parliament, is that the AI systems that they use also to provide some contents, basically what we call the algorithms that are behind like the reels or the stories, well, no, the reels and the TikToks, etc. So that would be considered, according to the European Parliament version, as a high-risk AI system. So that would come with all these requirements.
Okay, our next question is on whether open source AI solutions have complained that this act restricts open source that are a community effort. Is there anything in the legislation relating to this that would avoid stunting the creativity of community AIs?
Yes, there was something. I think I would struggle a bit to give you a precise answer now, so it's better if that person sends me an email as well. I think it's the European Parliament that has proposed something, which I think has quite some chances to go through. So there's some exemptions that are foreseen for the open source AI system. I can give you the full details by email if you allow me time to research the exact provision, because now I would take 5 minutes to go through the 200 pages of the legislation.
Okay, and then we have a question asking, will there be any measures to protect the EU from AI coming from other countries such as the USA or China, which may not have these rules?
Yes, so as I said in the beginning, I'll try to find it, I think it was here maybe, yes. So this legislation will apply to providers and users in the EU, but also if we have a provider of AI system who is based outside of the European Union and they want to put into service their system in the European Union, they will be covered by the legislation. Or if there is an AI system that produces an output in the European Union and the output is used in the Union, they will be covered by this legislation.
Okay, and we have a question asking, do I understand correctly that the regulation will be a CE regulation? Any idea on what type of technical documentation is needed and what quality management system is needed? And will the certification require third-party assessment of the actual product similar to MDR?
Yes, so it will be a legislation that has similar applications as the single market, and of course there will be the CE marking will be required, so they will have to follow certain types of requirements. There will be some quality assessments and some certificate of conformity, etc. So it's all these boring things that I have decided to remove from my presentation. But I can provide more information because everything is really listed in the legislation. There are like plenty of annexes that say like this and this and this should be done, and the system should conform with this and this. It's a bit of bureaucracy, I would say. So that's why it was not in my presentation. Otherwise, we would still be in the second chapter, I think. But if you email me, I can send you all the information. I will receive plenty of email after this webinar. I'm a bit scared already.
Thank you. So now we have a question. All LEA AI solutions should not be qualified as high risk automatically, don't you think?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, that's all LEA AI solutions should not be qualified as high risk automatically.
So I'm not exactly sure what OLEA means. LEA is law enforcement authorities, so maybe it's linked to that. I'm not, like, I should have asked to the things of what I am not in the beginning of this presentation. I'm not a decision maker, so I cannot take such decision. However, what I would recommend to those of you who are not happy with the provisions, to take contact with your national ministries and the relevant organization in the ministries who coordinates this legislation, because as I said, the member states are yet to adopt their formal position on the text. So it is the way now to pass some amendments. So it's important you go to your ministry, you say, we're not happy with that. We need to have such applications that should not be in the list of high-risk system. And then it would be up to the country to propose an amendment through the council.
Okay, so we have one final question, and just a reminder before we do that the presentation and the recording will be available by tomorrow morning. So if you would like to review the slides or watch the presentation again, you will receive that, especially if you're signed up to our newsletter, you'll receive it in there. So on to our final question, which is a bit of a broader one. What do you think are the potential implications regarding the emergency services?
What do I think? I think in general, there may be a few practices that are considered as high-risk AI systems. What do I think? I think this legislation doesn't go too far, because I think it is quite fair to require to have some protocols, basically, to reflect on how we use such systems, to have some data governance programs, some technical documentations, which I believe already exist. And so all of these things, I think it is fair to require it, that there are some like cybersecurity basic requirements also that are fulfilled and things like that. I think it is quite fair. Also for the PSAPs, when they apply an AI system, I think it's good that they know that this would be reliable and robust, and that there is no possible misuse or like misuse with deep consequences. So I think it is quite fair what is asked. Then what I think is a bit polemical is the use of AI systems by the law enforcement authorities that are in what I described in the list of banned practices. So especially the European Parliament proposed the identification from CCTV footage. I'm not in a position to really have actually not a clear opinion on this. So I know this will be quite controversial, and it will be a main topic of discussion in the next interinstitutional negotiation. So that is to be seen. Myself, I'm not in a position to really have a valuable opinion on this. And that's the same for the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems. I think, of course, this may have some implication on the law enforcement authorities. myself, I don't have a view on this.
Okay, that is all of our questions. So I think we will thank you, Benoit, for your presentation and thank everyone for attending. And as mentioned before, the recording of presentation will be available shortly. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
And feel free to reach out by email or LinkedIn for any follow-up question. You have my details here. Thank you, Amy, also.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.